Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
And good evening, I'm Errol Laborde. Marcia is off tonight. While Tropical Storm Sydney had more bark than bite, there was still damage done by the noise. We'll assess the damage as well as trying to decipher the new language and technology of tropical storms. Healthcare was in the news this week. We'll examine the politics as well as the ongoing health and care of Congressman Steve Scalise. Elsewhere, the city cracked down on short-term rentals in the French Quarter, and we'll look at a new media plan to cover the Louisiana coast. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources: Jeff Adelson, reporter for the New Orleans Advocate; Kevin McGill, reporter for the Associated Press; Mark Schlefstein, environmental reporter for NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune; and Stephanie Grace, columnist for the New Orleans Advocate. And Stephanie, let's start off with our Steve Scalise update. What's the latest?
Good news today, he's out of intensive care. So this is about 9 days after, or 10 days after he was shot. It turns out near fatally. We found out a few days later. His hip was shattered. The bullet, it was an assault weapon, so it was a bullet that did a lot of damage, went into organs, to bones. He's had a number of surgeries, but he's doing well. He is talking to people. He's texting. Paul Ryan says he wants to talk about policy, so that's he's been watching LSU. He's been watching baseball on TV. So he's on the road to recovery. It's going to be a long recovery, but it's looking good, and of course, everyone's very thankful for that.
Now, when they talk about the long recovery, obviously, he seems to be mentally in good shape.
Yeah.
Now, we're talking about just being able to move around and go back into his office.
And various reconstructive surgeries. They haven't gone into a lot of detail on what damage there was to organs, but he did. His hip was shattered. His leg was broken. It's there's a lot they're going to have to kind of put back together, it sounds like. But it sounds like he's getting terrific care and is in good spirits.
So far, either he or his staff have been visited by the president, by Paul Ryan, and by Bono.
Bono was U2 played and watched. I don't know. I saw a lot of Twitter activity about U2 and Bono. He got a shout out at the concert, which was in the DC area. That wished him well and wished him a speedy recovery.
So, what do you think will come out of this in the long run? In terms of people have to be thinking about, we need to change something.
There was. As usually happens when we have a tragedy like this, there's some talk about civility, trying to bring civility back. Actually, the new congressman from North Louisiana, Mike Johnson, he's tried to, he got most of the freshman Congress people to sign on to a pledge to be civil with each other. They kind of renewed it this week. On the other hand, we had a big special election in Georgia this week, and the Republicans won. It was, the most expensive congressional election ever, $50 million, seen as kind of a referendum on the parties, and there's a lot of trash talking. I think we're back to normal.
Yeah, one of the great ironies of this thing was that the shooting happened at a practice for what may be one of the last bastions of collegiality in Congress, the congressional baseball game. Things seem to go right back to where they were.
And actually, there was a third-party group that used an ad including footage of Steve Scalise being taken off the field in a stretcher, a really awful ad that was condemned by both sides that basically said, here's your crazy left-wing in action. And the Republican candidate, Karen Handel, who won, did condemn it.
But I think we need to point out that non-civility is not unique to this age, that it's been throughout history. No matter what you think about Mike Pence as vice president, I think it's fairly certain that he will never shoot the Secretary of the Treasury like Aaron Burr, past vice president, did. And the type of
we can hope.
the type of rage used to have between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and during the era of John. It's always been there. Now it's maybe being fed a little bit more by the internet. But
and yet you used to hear of Republicans and Democrats getting together a lot more often and trying to work out different. Even if publicly they were saying awful things about each other, there was some behind-the-scenes cooperation that you just don't hear about anymore. It's just too dangerous for politically speaking, for one side to make an advance toward the other.
And they don't, everybody goes home on the weekend, so they don't socialize together. You know, one exception to that, ironically, is Steve Scalise, who actually kind of was good friends with Cedric Richmond, a Democrat and Republican, and their families spend time together. And Cedric Richmond was very involved in kind of alerting Steve Scalise's allies, you know, keeping them informed what was happening last week.
Okay, let's talk about a storm of a different kind with Tropical Storm Cindy. For all the warnings and the furor, it wasn't too bad here, but you've been looked at the entire area.
Yeah,
what was your assessment?
Anchoring the story from New Orleans, it was kind of remarkable that although the storm itself in Louisiana didn't pack that much of a punch by the time it made landfall, and that's not to say there wasn't damage, but it wasn't what we were all worried about early in the week. But the geographic scope of it, as the weather spun in from as the moist air spun in from the Gulf, you had that heartbreaking death of the 10-year-old in Baldwin County, Alabama. He was vacationing with his family, walked out on the beach and was hit by debris pushed by the rough surf. Had a tornado just outside of Birmingham in Fairfield, Alabama, that flattened a few businesses. There was at least one injury there, and there were severe weather warnings and watches for floods and heavy rain off to the Carolinas and up toward the Illinois and Indiana state lines even yesterday, and the storm has now made it up just about that far now, but the scope of it was pretty big here in Louisiana, and it was a formidable storm at one point. As Mark will be telling us, I'm sure it was 60 miles per hour sustained winds at one point. It looked like it was going to be pretty dangerous. FEMA had sent an advanced crew in, I'm told today, but I'm told also that they were leaving today because the damage is not going to come anywhere near disaster level.
But the kind of high waters you see in the town of Lafitte and down to Plaquemines Parish, isn't that something that people know is going to happen, that's there?
I think if you have a storm coming and churning in the Gulf of any strength, and you're going to have strong southerly winds or high tides, that's something that people along there are pretty used to. Mayor Kerner seemed a little more concerned down in Lafitte than generally happens during a storm, but still the voluntary evacuation was called off, and there was some water in homes and businesses, as there was on the North Shore, as there was all along the coast here and there, but it wasn't a major storm.
All right. Mark, I know if I could ask you, the rains that we had that affected Baton Rouge last year, this was not the same sort of weather phenomenon, was it?
No. Well, this was a tropical event, and the weather that occurred last year was sort of a combination of just a basic rainfall event, but it had some tropical characteristics to it, but those tropical characteristics were actually linked by several scientists to global warming and the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is warmer at that time of year than it has been ever, and the result of that is that you end up with more water in the air that comes ashore, and you have the ability to create thunderstorms from it. And we're going to be seeing that in the future much more along the coast.
We'll talk more about that. But Kevin, as far as you know, not all the levees down there are federal levees, but there are some small levees. Did all the levees hold up? Did everything do its job?
I saw no reports of levees breaching. I think there were some concerns, and I don't know if it happened in Lafitte of levees overtopping. But yeah, I think everything held up fairly well.
Okay, and so overall everything seemed to work out and everybody did their job.
It worked out mainly because of meteorological luck, I guess, as the storm weakened as it came ashore. But I guess the remarkable thing about this is it's mid-June, and it's the second named storm in mid-June that looked threatening. Brett fizzled out, but this one was 60. This one was a strong storm for a while, and the experts are saying 11 to 17 named storms, maybe as many as 9 hurricanes this year. So.
And a big storm.
Yeah, and a couple of major ones.
Okay. Well, Mark, you sort of regard you as our weather guru, our science guru here. But I got to tell you, watching the coverage earlier this week, I was kind of shocked because this was the first major event of the new season.
You got confused a little bit?
Yeah, and I heard some terminology I've never heard applied. Cyclone. All right. Now, usually a cyclone was something that's heading toward an island in the Pacific. Then all of a sudden they're talking about cyclones in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, what? I mean, it's just like, should we all
So-
leave, or what's this?
No. The problem here. Okay, so cyclone basically is a system that is circular in nature, and so it applies. They use that term both in tropical cyclones, which is what this was, and hurricanes are tropical cyclones as well. It's the entire category that includes hurricanes and tropical storms as well. But what was really going on was that this year the National Hurricane Center decided that they were going to start issuing not just watches and warnings, but actual forecasts for storms before they became even a tropical depression. So when they were still in what they call the invest stage, a term that really means investigation.
And this word invest is becoming more prominent too.
Yeah, it's
A
just
few
a
years
shortening
ago,
of the word investigation.
A few
and
years ago,
it's-
you never heard them talk about invest.
Right.
Okay, and now they're numbered, invest number 98, and
Right.
we're hearing more about those.
This is all part of a process that's been occurring over the last 15 to 20 years, where the National Hurricane Center is having to address concerns that have been raised by a lot of their users that include the public, but also include the Navy. And so the Navy wants forecasts much broader, and they want to know where they can send their ships, where they're not going to run into a chance of a tropical event as far in advance as they possibly can. So the National Hurricane Center this year has decided that they're going to put out these messages that will explain, hey, we've got a storm that the models are showing is going to grow into something, and so we're going to start issuing forecasts on it, and we're going to call it a cyclone in those forecasts just because it's a good word to use, and it describes what it is, but it's a word we're not using when it becomes a tropical storm.
What comes first, though, the invest or the cyclone?
Well, the invest is usually there for a low pressure system that has the chance of forming a cyclone. But it can be there for a cyclone.
And what was wrong with
as well.
saying low pressure system?
Nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that all it does is describe the low pressure.
Not scary enough?
It doesn't give you the circular nature of what the low pressure system could be.
And tells you that they're looking at it, basically.
Exactly.
And then haven't they also changed the dimensions of those cones?
Well, yeah,
Everything?
they've also part of the other bit of this is that they're now allowing those cones to be developed over for a 5-day forecast at a much earlier stage, even when we have this pre-tropical depression forecast. They're using those cones to do that, and they're using it. They're also have different maps that show sort of a cone situation to give you a better opportunity to understand when's the earliest time that tropical storm force winds might approach your area, again in advance of when they might actually have a tropical storm out there. So all of those are products that are available to be used to help people understand what's coming at them.
Just real quick, of all those spaghetti model things we see, do you have a favorite spaghetti? One that you rely on?
Well, more and more I'm going to the one that the National Hurricane Center has spent the most time developing, and that's something called HWRF.
HWRF, okay.
HWRF. And there's a new version of it out this year. It seems to be doing a pretty good job, but the reality is that people should understand that the model stuff is just a game.
Okay.
And it's used by the emergency managers and by the forecasters to use their best judgment of where the storm is going based on everything that they know. It's just a tool.
Okay, Jeff, there was a storm of a different sort in the fourth quarter during the week. Finally, this new law governing short-term rentals has been in place, and the city started calling people in and adjudicating and fining.
Yeah, we had the first 10 properties to go through the violation process for violating the short-term rental laws. Excuse me. 7 of those were actually received fines on Wednesday for a total of $17,000. That's almost the maximum. That,
So it's about
that they could have done.
$500 a piece.
17,000, excuse me. So it was about 3,000 or so a piece. One of the properties, because of some technicalities, got a lower set of fines, but about 6 of them received the maximum fines and the maximum number of violations they could receive for a single set of violations. So it was a fairly strong statement by the hearing officer and by the enforcement side that they're not going to take this lightly. Even, frankly, the city's Safety and Permits Department, which is doing the enforcement, before the hearing had said they didn't anticipate the maximum fines. They were expecting, the first couple rounds of these to be, much lower, $100 versus $500 kind of thing. But clearly they're starting off strong and starting off trying to send a message.
Now, from your coverage, an argument that some of these people were used, they said, well, when this new law was passed, we took the sign down, it's not allowing short-term rentals, and the adjudicator responded, but it never was legal to have short-term rentals to begin with, so you shouldn't have been doing it.
There was one specific property, and that's the one that didn't get the maximum fines, where they said, we stopped advertising for this after the enforcement went into effect, not the new law though, and so the adjudication officer reduced the fine on that one. Short-term rentals have been banned in the city, pretty much always, and with even stronger rules against them in the French Quarter. So,
but it's allowed in most of the city now, except in parts of the French Quarter.
That's correct. Most of the French Quarter is exempt from it's still banned in most of the French Quarter. Most of the rest of the city, there's a whole structure allowing these short-term rentals, depending on what kind of property it is, how much of it you're renting out, that sort of thing.
Jeff, I'm wondering if you can speak to how do they find the people who are doing the illegal? Is it in cooperation with Airbnb? Are these always Airbnb people, or are they finding other means of rental?
They're not all Airbnb, and I would say the cooperation with Airbnb is fairly limited. The city is getting a little bit of information from them, but it's all anonymized. So even if the city wanted to go after people that they found there, they don't have addresses or locations or anything like that. A lot of these seem to be, complaints from neighbors, and there's certainly a lot of those. There's something like 550 or so potential violations listed on the city's website, and most of those have been sort of stacking up for years while the city didn't really have any enforcement process, because neighbor sees a party going on next door, the next weekend it's a different group of people having a party there, they call it in. The other thing, and this had been easy for the city originally, is because there's no rentals allowed at all in the French Quarter, they could just pull up Airbnb or VRBO or any of these other sites, look at the map and say, okay, well, this is a property on Dauphine Street in the French Quarter. You can't do that, and they could track it down. It's gotten harder because a lot of people have caught on to that and have stopped putting pictures of the front of their buildings on the site, and Airbnb and some of the others anonymize exactly where it is. So the property is somewhere in a multi-block radius. But
Something else that people are looking closely to is the Senate Republicans' new health care plan, which was released yesterday, and obviously a lot of discussion about it. It seems the essential argument is about Medicaid. Medicaid on one hand, cutting back on Medicaid, which the plan calls for, but at the same time, allowing or cutting back on the number of privileges for wealthy people in terms of taxes.
Taxes, yeah. It's really, and it's interesting. It was interesting to see so many of the headlines be, tax cuts for wealthy versus Medicaid cuts. Medicaid, and it's interesting because, the conversation didn't really start out about Medicaid. It started out, when people complained about the Affordable Care Act, they're generally talking about the exchanges, the private insurance that, with subsidies that, some people are having real trouble getting policies that are affordable, that don't have huge deductibles. And, Congress could, and really there's bipartisan agreement that that's a problem. Congress really could have addressed just that and could have done it very easily in a bipartisan fashion. That's not what they're doing because Obamacare became such a potent Republican symbol over the years, and all of a sudden they have Congress and the White House, so they kind of need to do something. And so what they're doing is really much broader than addressing the exchanges, although they are addressing those. The bill the Senate came out with, and it's interesting because the House, when the House passed a bill, the Senate kind of said, don't worry about that. We're going to write our own bill. We're going to kind of start from scratch. That's not what happened. That's not remotely what happened. They got a committee, Mitch McConnell, the leader, appointed a 13-member committee, all male, it was widely pointed out, to address things like, maternity coverage, but also, excluded some people who are moderates, it included some people from the conservative wing and excluded some moderates, such as Bill Cassidy on this issue, our senator. And they came up with a plan in secret that, there was a lot of curiosity about it. There were a lot of leaks about it. There were attempts, on video for the Democrats to go to the Congressional Budget Office and try to get a copy, and they couldn't. They finally released it yesterday in anticipation of a vote that McConnell hopes to hold next week, which is incredibly fast for something of this scope. And, the big news is that it slashes Medicaid in very big ways, and not just the Medicaid expansion that was part of the Affordable Care Act, and that you'll remember Governor Edwards adopted after Governor Jindal did not, and
John Bell Edwards.
John Bell Edwards, and is now covering over 400,000 Louisianans, and he talks about it all the time. He talks about the people who've gotten, the working poor people who've gotten preventative care and have gotten cancer screenings and discovered diseases early. It's very popular here, and that's one of the reasons he talks about it. It's very popular wherever it's happened. And this plan calls for rolling it back. Down the road, they're delaying the effect of it, which I think they hope helps them politically. It would happen in 2021 and after. But it also goes after the other parts of Medicaid and how Medicaid is funded in general. And it looks at basically, instead of reimbursing states for what they spend, having kind of a cap on it. And what that would mean is really less spending. And the onus would be on the states to figure out how to spend less. And when you sit back and look at Medicaid, we're talking about a program that covers 70 million people in this country, and affects, everybody knows it goes towards poor people, but it also goes towards elderly people in nursing homes, a huge percentage, about half the childbirths, children with disabilities, adults with disabilities. It's really, a lot of people who don't have other options, who are vulnerable. And Governor Edwards is very upset. There's a bipartisan group of governors that he's joined with to ask them not to do this, including John Kasich, the former presidential candidate. It would hurt hospitals. It would hurt rural hospitals, the medical societies. Really, it's hard to find a fan of this.
Bill Cassidy, who because he's also a doctor,
Yes.
gets a lot of attention on this issue, and he pointed out that no matter what the outcome is, there will never be a final health care bill. That as time goes on, there'll always be new problems. He says back in the days when AIDS was a problem, they had to modify that. In the age of the baby boomers getting older, okay, you have to modify that. And so they said there'll always be a health care legislation in progress in some way.
Right.
And we'll be following it. So anyway.
Okay, and everyone's watching his vote, of course, because
Sure,
he's been very outspoken on this, and he's still maybe on the fence, although maybe not.
Well, NOLA.com, the Times Picket Unit, started a new Louisiana coastal watch
team
unit, so you can be watching. Let me tell you, I respect environmental reporting, and I'm glad that people are doing it. The thing that always kind of frustrates me a little bit is I never know where we're going. I mean, are we making progress? I mean, we've been hearing all these years about the football fields and all of that.
That's a very good question, and that's one of the things that this team was set up to do, was to especially take sort of a measure of all of the money that's coming to the state through the BP oil spill fines that's going to be used for the master plan. The master plan is going to get a shot in the arm. $10 to $12 billion will be available that nobody can touch, including the president, and will be used mostly for coastal restoration. So as those projects move forward, we felt that we needed to figure out a way of better covering what's going on and determining whether or not these projects are going to work, whether or not they actually are working once they're put in place, and how much the money is going into them, and where the money is being spent, and who's getting, who's benefiting from it. And so we were lucky enough to get a grant that was run through the Society of Environmental Journalists, and it comes from the Walton Family Foundation, to pay for 2 reporters for 3 years. And those reporters are on the ground, and they are doing great guns, starting to look at individual projects and at how individual locations are dealing with issues that are facing our coast on a daily basis.
So I understand and appreciate there's a lot of investigating ahead, but you as somebody that's been following it for years.
Right,
do you
so
think
where are we?
Are we making progress?
I think that the Coastal Master Plan did a really good job of resetting where things were. We are in much worse shape than we thought we were even 5 years ago. The reality is that sea level rise is going to be significant over the next 50 years, and is going into the future after that. And the result of that is that we have a much greater level of risk that we're all going to be facing if we don't get that money out there and spend it. And the question is whether or not these projects will actually work, and we don't know the answer yet as to whether or not they will.
Okay. Well, let's look for some more immediate answers here. What should we be looking for in the near future, Jeff?
Well, just to follow up on the short-term rental stuff, what really will matter is how the city continues this effort. If they continue doing enforcement, if they continue cracking down, and that's where it's really going to determine whether or not they're going to be able to rein the illegal short-term rentals in.
Kevin?
I was going to follow up on that as well, because I'm starting to see major event organizers start to encourage their participants, their visitors to the city, to align themselves to check into real hotels rather than Airbnbs. And it'll be interesting to see if that's a trend that continues.
More?
The U.S. Water Alliance is going to be in town next week. It's a group of water professionals, people who work at the Sewage and Water Board and similar agencies across the nation and around the world. And they're going to be looking at that horrible non-4-letter word infrastructure and how much money we need to spend on it.
Okay.
A lot.
Stephen?
This weekend, Mayor Landrieu becomes head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors organization. Like his father before him, like Mark Morial before him, and like Mark Morial's father, Dutch. There's a long tradition of New Orleans mayors heading this agency, which is very high profile and will make him, kind of one of the lead spokespeople for cities around the country. And certainly there's a lot of attention on how cities are dealing with the Trump administration. So expect him to get even more national press, I would say.
Okay. Jeff, Stephanie, real quick, any new information on the mayor's race? Any new names surfacing?
It's still fairly
Still out there,
fairly
okay.
static. There's a lot of names that people are waiting to hear what happens. Mainly Karen Carter-Peterson, Walt Leger, Sidney Torres are the three to watch at this point.
Good. Well, thanks to all of you. You did a great job. Thanks to you all for watching. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.